how would we define internalization?
Yeah, that's one of the more controversial concepts of the theory.
Okay.
Um, and the term that Vygotsky used in Russian really meant growing in. It wasn't actually literally internalization, right?
Okay. Hmm.
But and so one of the problems with the term internalization is it can lead you to believe that there's this dualism between the inner and the outer,
Okay.
right? And first of all, what Vygotsky argued is that there is no inner without the outer, right? There is no, so there isn't, you don't begin with an internal consciousness in which you take in the outer. It's the taking in that creates the internal higher consciousness, right? Because all you have at the beginning are instincts,
Mm.
right? But and so one of the best definitions that I've come across for what Vygotsky meant by internalization was produced by Gordon Wells in his book Dialogic Inquiry.
Hmm.
And he describes it as, I'm going to paraphrase, he describes it as the process in which you create an activity or a behavior that you observe other people doing
Hmm.
for yourself. And that involves a process of, excuse me, of imitation. So an imitation for Vygotsky was a crucial part of development, right? It wasn't this behaviorist way of thinking about, mimicking or parroting, but it was a creative process.
Mm.
Um, and so the way to think about internalization is the process through which we attempt to imitate behaviors that we observe, including linguistic behaviors that
Hmm.
we observe in other people,
Hmm.
right? And it's not, you're not actually taking something from outside and putting it inside. It's not a transfer process,
Hmm.
right? It's a creative process. And the imitative process is not is not a perfect copy. James Mark Baldwin, who was a contemporary of Vygotsky, an American sociologist and sort of psychologist,
Hmm.
wrote a lot about the importance of imitation. And he talked about it as a creative process in which the child attempts to create for themselves what they see other people doing.
Hmm.
But in doing that, they slightly change what they're trying to recreate. So
Okay.
it's not a copy. It's not an exact copy. It's not sort of what a parrot would do, but it's a creative, transformative process. And Vygotsky
Yeah.
uses the term transformative process when he describes imitation.
Why is it that merely learning is not considered internalization, but the learner has to actually be able to perform the task? Why is that step important, and how does it relate to the concept of self-regulation?
Well, the goal of development is self-regulation, right? That is the ability to control yourself, to control your behavior. So self-regulation is the ability to act independently, right? But to be able to do that, you have to act collaboratively first with other people or other artifacts, right? Cultural artifacts or
Mhm.
people, right? In some sense, you can think of people as cultural artifacts as well, right?
Okay.
Um, right? Your parents are representatives of the culture that
Hmm.
help you become a member of that culture and to think and behave as a member of that culture, right? So, yeah, the idea then is that self-regulation is the ability to sustain yourself, to control your own behavior independently of other people. But the problem is we don't always, we're not always capable of sustaining that. So we can lose it sometimes. Adults even are not perfect knowers and perfect uh, behaviorers, right?
Hmm.
We can lose control, particularly under emotional circumstances, right? When you're under a lot of stress or you're very emotional about something, positive or negative emotions, right? You can lose control of your thinking and of your own behavior, and emotions can take over, right? You lose regulation. And so, or when you're engaged in a difficult cognitive task, like doing a complex math problem or trying to make sense out of some data, right? And then you need some other forms of mediation. And one of the forms of mediation that people rely on is external, going back to an earlier phase of development. So you begin to talk to yourself out loud. You
Mhm.
begin to maybe write, take notes. You know, when you read, you write in the margins often, right? To try to help you understand what it is you're reading. Those writings are intended for you, not for somebody else, right? They're intended as a way of maintaining your thinking, regulating yourself in the process. The same thing when you underline text and so on, right? It's a way of externally mediating your thinking, right? To keep control. And sometimes if things are really complicated and complex, you need to turn to somebody else to help you
Mm.
remediate yourself, right? And this is where you see the zone of proximal development becoming
Okay.
crucial, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So would it be accurate then to say that development in SCT is understood, or this change is understood as the internalization of mediating tools that allow people to self-regulate, to perform actions and tasks independently?
Yes. Yes. So linguistically, for example, as a native speaker of Spanish, you know pretty much, and you can monitor pretty much your own performance. You know when you make mistakes, when you make a slip of the tongue, you know pretty much what is and what is not appropriate Spanish, right? A learner might not know that, right? And so they are not completely autonomous in their regulation. They need mediation by somebody else, by a teacher or a tutor or whomever, or a dictionary, whatever the case may be, right? But as a native speaker of the language, chances are that you're going to have a lot more control and be able to sustain yourself in pretty much any kind of communicative activity, unless it's something you've never experienced before, right? So if I ask you to talk about nuclear physics,
Mhm.
probably can't, right? Even though you're a native speaker of Spanish,
Okay,
you
and,
probably
and
can't.
now then we're in the terrain of CPD. And I have three quotes that I think would help our audience understand the concept.
Um, One of the things you have to keep in mind about reading the English translations of Vygotsky's writings
Mm-hmm.
is that sometimes the translations are not completely accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some controversy about how the English rendering of what Vygotsky wrote in Russian comes out. And if you read, at least according to Nikolai Verasov, who's written about this quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
if you read the original Russian, it Vygotsky intended the ZPD to be a diagnostic tool. It's a way of diagnosing the development of a person, not determining the development of the person, but diagnosing the development of a person. And his argument was you don't fully understand, you don't have a full diagnosis unless you can project the person's future development.
Mm-hmm.
So most assessments are assessing the past, the history of the person. So an IQ test
Mm-hmm.
assesses your past, your history. Proficiency tests assess your history. And Vygotsky says, yeah, that's important. But unless you know where the person is going, you can't really help them develop. You need to figure out what's in the process of maturing. And so he uses, I think, a really nice agricultural metaphor where he talks about the seeds of development, the blossoms of development, and the fruits of development, right? So the seeds would be the very early stages of future development, where the person probably needs a lot of mediation to be able to perform a particular activity. The blossoms show more control, right? Where you need less mediation and maybe qualitatively different mediation. And then the full fruit would be complete independent performance, right? Where the fruit is ripe and it's ready to be picked, right? So I think that's a really nice metaphor. And so the idea is it's a prediction about the future, but it's based on some empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence is how the person responds to the mediation provided by somebody else or some artifact, right? Because in a sense, when you read something, you're the person, the author of what you're reading is mediating you, right? Even though that person is not present, their artifact that they created is. And in a sense, that's creating a zone of proximal development with you through the author's text, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea then is to look at the implications of this idea for education. And one of the things that Vygotsky writes about is it's inappropriate to group students on the basis of traditional placement tests because it's showing their past, but it's not projecting their future. So you can have two people with the same past, but very different futures. And so he says schools should be organized by ZPD, and they would be more effective. Your teaching would be more effective if you could organize it by the students who have a small or a large ZPD or somewhere in between, right? And so whether they're only seeds or whether they have no ZPD, right? Nothing is developing, then you need a lot of teaching and intervention. To students who need just very little to make it to the fruit, right? And he says schools would be way more effective if we organize classrooms that way rather than on past, on the history.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
I think you gave a perfect explanation of how this ZPD is not only social, it has the individual part as well as it's also a process, not just an area where things are.
No, it's not a place. It's an activity.
Yes.
So you always have to think about the concept in Vygotsky's theory as doings, as activities. Right. You also have to worry about the misconception of the ZPD as scaffolding. Because it's not scaffolding.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, because it's about development. And development is not just about doing a task. Development is about transfer. It's about the ability to take what you learned here through this activity and extend it to other activities. That's what true development is like. And if you can't do that, then you really haven't developed fruit.
Yes.
You're still, so scaffolding is just getting people through a task. But that's not what the ZPD is about. The key there is development.
Yeah. And we have a whole session on sorry, a whole section on myths. So, but before we go into the myths, just two questions about pedagogy, because for example, we have this idea of tools, artifacts, and mediation. How does this relate to concept-based language instruction? We're now in pedagogy. Yeah.
So concept-based language instruction emerged from the writings of Peter Galperin, who was, I wouldn't say a student of Vygotsky. I would say he was influenced by Vygotsky. He was a contemporary, more or less, slightly younger than Vygotsky, lived longer than Vygotsky. And the idea was he wanted to explore this topic of internalization. And because he felt Vygotsky didn't really fully explain internalization, the process, how it worked, right? So he set out to I'm sorry, to focus on internalization as a process. How is it motivated? What does it look like? How do we know when something has been internalized, right? And out of that research, he then extended it into pedagogy, into schools. because schooling is about the internalization of concepts, right? Conceptual knowledge, scientific concepts, right? That you don't normally have access to in everyday life, right? So in school, you learn about things that you don't learn about in the everyday world, and you learn often about the hidden parts of reality, right? Whether it be science or whether it be art or whether it be, whatever.
Yeah.
You learn about, and you can learn about things that you've never experienced or never could experience, like studying about the French Revolution, for example, right?
Yeah.
None of us could ever experience that, right, directly. But you can learn about it, you can understand it. And that comes about largely through school, through formal education. The same thing with language, right? Um, even though all children learn at least one language through everyday means, they don't really know how they do it, right? They don't do it in a sense conceptually, because most people can't explain to you what they know about language,
Yeah.
about their language. They can tell you whether something sounds right or not, but they can't tell you how it's formed. They can't give you a linguistic explanation of what they're doing, right? Even though they can do it, just
Mhm.
as I can tell you that I feel certain things going on in my body. I have a pain, I have a whatever, but I can't tell you why. You need special knowledge for that, right? So the same thing with language. And so Galperin uh, realized that what education needed to do was to find a way to maximally ensure that concepts would be appropriately internalized by the learners. And so he developed a system. His system was fairly rigid because and his pedagogy was fairly rigid. And it had a sequence of stages that he said you have to pass through: one stage, another stage, another stage, and another stage. Um, and he developed a broad pedagogical program for pretty much all school subjects, ranging from history to literature to mathematics to science to language. And he tried it out they ran something like 800 studies across a whole uh, a range of schools in the old Soviet Union. And but the problem was that their understanding of language was pretty structural.
Mm.
And as I told you before, our understanding of language is semiotic, not structural, right? So the way they taught language was sort of like a flow chart, to use subjunctive in Spanish, if this, then that, if this, then the other thing, and you had to work your way through a flow chart. But
Mm.
subjunctive in Spanish is fluid. It's not, it's not a fixed set of rules
Yeah.
that everybody follows all the time, right? It has to do with the kind of meaning that you want to profile for an interlocutor, right? So we've used um, cognitive linguistics and systemic functional linguistics to provide the conceptual structure, right? So, but we took the sort of the basics of Galperin's program and modified them for what we see as our understanding of language as a semiotic and not as just a structural system. Right? And so there's a series of what we call phases. They're not necessarily rigid stages that you have to go through, but
Mhm.
they involve, right, the visual representation of knowledge, because visually, the advantage of visualizing a concept is that it's holistic. You can see the whole concept rather than verbal, which is sequential. And visual representations are easier to remember rather than verbal definitions, which are most often by students memorized without an understanding, right?
Mhm.
So, so we could go through the phases if you want me to, but it basically starts with what is it the students know about the concept at the start? What do they know about the concept at the end? And what can they do with the concept through communicative activities? But
Mhm.
and so the visualizations are forms of mediation, right?
Mhm.
So the learners need the visual to mediate. It's external mediation, right?
Yes.
And then the next step is to move from the visual representation to verbal representation, where the students have to verbalize their understanding, that is using private speech, right? And so you can see that you're moving from a completely external, independent form of mediation
Mm-hmm.
to a more self-focused mediation, where I talk to myself about the concept, first externally and then internally,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then I link that to practice so that I no longer have to use external forms of mediation in private speech, right? I can gain control over the concept, and then I can use it in communicative activities. And so it becomes then internalized in a sense, right? That is, I can imitate but the crucial thing is I can now manipulate the concept as I want to. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not following a set of rules. I'm manipulating the concept to create the meanings that I want to create, which may or may not reflect all native speaker norms, but of course, native speakers don't always follow the same norm.
Yeah.
Millions of native speakers of any language, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't all follow the same norm. They don't all decide to communicate the same event in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have options, right? And that's the idea. So so that independence and self-regulation here would be the ability to manipulate the concept in speech and in writing to create the kinds of meanings and profile the kinds of meanings that you want to profile for a reader or for a speaker.
Very good. Very good. So we just joined two things that may feel separate for some readers, which is this whole idea of concepts, artifacts, and mediation, and this pedagogy of concept-based language instruction. So we're still in pedagogy, and so now I would like to ask, how does the ZPD as a process, as a historical process, relate to the concept of dynamic assessment?
Yeah. So then the term dynamic assessment was apparently coined by Vygotsky's colleague, A.R. Luria, in a speech he gave to a Western psychologist in 1961. It's actually published as a small article. Um, and so the idea was that by using the ZPD, assessment would no longer be this static tool that focused on the past, but it would be dynamic because it focused on the future. And so that's kind of the origin of the dynamic assessment, which is grounded or based on using the ZPD as a tool to diagnose the potential development of individuals or groups of individuals, right? Because you can have group ZPDs as well as individual ZPDs. Um, and that was the origin of uh, dynamic assessment and its connection to ZPD. Um, it was originally used in child psychology by, I would say, by people like Carol Litz, who was a school psychologist and who wrote about it, published several books in the 1990s
Mm-hmm.
using the concept. Um, and then we extended it. I think we were the first. No, I shouldn't say we were the first. There were other people that used it to as a placement tool for language.
Okay.
Um, but I think we were the first to probably really look deeply at the concept of the zone of proximal development, particularly in the work of Matt Poner, who's, I would say, the leading
Okay.
person in the area of L2 dynamic assessment. Yeah.
Very good. And so how would a conception of development as both social, historical, and yeah, as a process, as something that can be in a group, how can that clash with, for example, something like a proficiency test like TOEFL?
Well, proficiency test, and Bill Frawley and I wrote in 1985, we wrote a paper that criticized proficiency tests, particularly as they were being pushed by organizations like the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages, uh, as as a means of assessing learner proficiency, right? And there are all kinds of problems with that test, but they continue to use it. For one thing, it makes a lot of money, so I think there's a profit issue involved in it as well. But the idea is again that uh, psychometricians. I remember when we first gave our first talk that we gave on dynamic assessment
Mm-hmm.
at the British Association of Applied Linguistics in 1987 or 80. I don't remember the year exactly. Alan Davies, who was a leading testing person, he's now passed away, was a respondent, and he was completely befuddled by the idea because for him, assessment is completely separate from instruction, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the dualistic thinking that we had to confront. And it's why it's difficult, I think, for many people to really appreciate the significance of the theory because they've been educated as dualistic thinkers, right?
Mm.
You have the difference between learning and acquisition, teaching and assessment, um, all kinds of, teacher-centered, learner-centered pedagogy, which is better. So there's always this dualistic, rationale at work in terms of our thinking. And so Alan had a very difficult time seeing what we were arguing as assessment because it involved teaching, right?
Okay.
Because we were mediating people, right, in the assessment. But that's because he was thinking of assessment as past oriented and not future oriented. And if it's going to be future oriented, you kind of have to do some teaching as part of it, right? Mediation. If you're going to have empirical evidence of where the learner is going, right? What's ripening, to use Vygotsky's terminology. So that created a problem. Carol Litz had this really interesting way of thinking about because for psychometricians,
Mm-hmm.
using dynamic assessment as a assessment tool introduces an error measure because you're intervening in the assessment process. And Carol Litz says that's exactly what you want to do. You want to introduce an error measure into the assessment, and that error measure is what allows you to project the future of the
Okay.
learner. And of course, that's a taboo uh, for psychometrics, right? You want a clean test. You don't want any intervention in the test. And that's because their tests are past oriented and not future oriented.